Bernstein's Age of Anxiety is a symphony, and it's his second symphony. And he was known for putting soloists into his symphonies, so that essentially this symphony is really like a giant piano concerto. Shh, don't tell the conductor. But I really do feel like in the end, as a whole, it's symphonic. So it makes it quite interesting for me as the soloist. I have a very soloistic part some of the time, and I have very much a part that is inside the orchestra the rest of the time. And in terms of collaboration, it's one of those pieces that I don't get to just say, okay, here's how we're going to do it. It is really the conductor's baby. So whatever he or she decides in terms of the overall arc of the piece is what I try to fit into. And I try to come into it with a lot of ideas, of course, but I want to make their vision work, because in the end, their vision has to really come to life. Which brings me to the poem that it's based on, W.H. Auden's Age of Anxiety, which is, to call it a poem is really the understatement of the century. It's this giant tome with many, many words, most of them gorgeous, for like 100 pages. So I've read this a number of times over the years as I've done the piece many times, and it's always so revealing. It was written during World War II, right near the end of World War II, and one of my favorite lines in it, one of the characters says that the world needs a wash and a week's rest. You know, this feeling that everything was just dirty and bad and needed cleansing. Humanity needed cleansing. And there's a recurring idea that comes back in many different places in the poems where he says, many have perished, more will. And that becomes kind of like a rhythmic charge that continues, just talking about the toll of death in World War II. And really you can apply this to any age of anxiety, regardless of the specifics at hand. But in the poem, there are some very precise details. It's in New York. There are 4 characters, 3 men and a woman. They meet in a bar. They all have real specific details of their lives and where they've come from. But really, they embody all of us. They kind of symbolize everything that we can be. And Bernstein, when he was writing about the piece, said that he didn't want it to be an exact copy of what the poem was, but in many ways he divides the piece up in the same way that the poem is divided up. And you can hear certain influences. So there's one really neat little thing in the second section, which is still part of the first movement. It goes from the 7 ages of man to the 7 stages, both in the poem and in the symphony. But there's one place in the poem where it says, no entrance here without a subject. Now, Auden is referring to perhaps a literary subject, perhaps an idea. Bernstein takes that to mean what we in music would call a subject, which is the theme of a fugue of some kind or some kind of counterpoint. So there's little parallels, although Bernstein said that he wouldn't do that, and he's really not literal about the translation. There are a few little places where you can see the poem very specifically coming in. The first movement is this huge, colossal movement where you go through the development of man. And I think there's some symbolism in the fact that Bernstein uses developing variation technique throughout this movement. So he'll take one variation, and instead of having each variation be a variation on the same theme, they each pluck an idea from the previous variation and then form a brand new idea that follows on it. So I think there's a lot of symbolism about how people develop, about how society develops in that first movement. And it ends in a really big way, very powerfully. The second movement is the dirge. And here Auden talks about the sobbing world following the calamity that was World War II and the mourning for our colossal father, our colossal dad, which is maybe God, maybe it's some guiding force but somehow it's a loss of our way. And interestingly, Bernstein opens that movement with a tone row, which at that time was sort of the height of avant-garde writing, to use all 12 tones of a scale, not one after the next, but in a different order and in different voices. And that's where he's talking about the sobbing of the world and losing our way. The dirge is quite powerful, very beautiful section, and it morphs almost without a clear direction into the haze of the mask. I have to say, you're not supposed to have favorites, but the mask is my favorite part of this symphony. Very jazzy, very Bernstein. It's scored very lightly, so it's piano and some percussion and harp and double bass. Really, suddenly you feel like you're in a jazz club. In the story, this is the part, or in the poem, this is the part where the characters are all terribly, terribly drunk and trying out all sorts of things that they probably shouldn't in an Upper Manhattan apartment. And in the music, this was where Bernstein could let that side of him shine, even though this was for the concert stage. It's beautifully worked out. The balances are great. The harmonies are great. The rhythms are so satisfying, and it's so, so tuneful. And then the piece comes to an end in a way that was very sentimental, very Bernstein-esque. This is the part where I feel the conductor really has the most to say. The piano actually plays very little in the end. In the original ending, the piano didn't play at all. And then Bernstein thought, well, given how much the piano's done, I should really give them a chance to play at the end. So he put some piano in, but originally it wasn't in there. And you can hear that this is where the symphonic gesture is. This is where the idea of, well, if we're going to talk about the world's problems and society's problems, we really need a full orchestra.